The first gunshot Luke Calder ever heard was fired in anger, but the first promise he ever believed in came on a wind-heavy evening when the desert turned gold and an Apache woman stood across from him with fire in her eyes and sorrow in her silence. And in that moment the Wild West stopped being a place of blood and lawlessness and became a place of fate. Luke was a cowboy carved by loss, raised on a failing ranch near the Arizona border, a man who learned early that the land gives nothing freely and takes everything without apology. And on the day he met Ayanna, he was tracking stolen horses through scorched earth, unaware that destiny had already chosen him. Ayanna was not fragile or soft as stories claimed. She was proud, sharp-minded, and carried the strength of her people in her posture, her long black hair braided with meaning, her dark eyes holding the memory of ancestors who survived storms far crueler than men like Luke. And when they met at the edge of a dry riverbed with rifles raised, the air trembled with danger and something else neither of them understood. Words were exchanged with caution, suspicion, and grudging respect, because Ayanna was protecting her people's land, and Luke was chasing survival, and neither was willing to bend until the desert wind carried a child's cry from behind the Apache camp, reminding them both of what truly mattered. Luke lowered his gun first, not because he was weak, but because something in Ayanna's gaze demanded honesty, and in that instant the rules of the frontier shifted. Over the following weeks, forced peace turned into shared fires, guarded glances turned into conversations, and Luke learned that Ayanna's tribe was starving after broken treaties and lost hunting grounds, while Ayanna learned that Luke's ranch was hanging by a thread after raiders and drought had stripped it bare. Trust grew slowly, like grass after rain, fragile yet stubborn, and every stolen smile felt like a rebellion against a world that demanded they be enemies. Nights brought stories, Luke speaking of his mother buried beneath a lone oak, Ayanna speaking of songs sung at dawn to honor the dead. And somewhere between grief and hope, a quiet love took root, unspoken but undeniable. When the cavalry rode near the Apache land, suspicion returned like thunder, and Luke was tested in ways no gunfight ever could test him, because choosing Ayanna meant turning his back on men who looked like him, and laws written without mercy. When violence finally came, it came fast and ugly, but Luke stood between rifles and the Apache camp, risking his life to buy time, proving with action what words never could. And when the dust settled and lives were spared, Ayanna touched his face as if confirming he was real. Love in the West was never gentle, and theirs was forged in fear, sacrifice, and courage. And when Luke asked for her hand not as a conqueror, but as a man willing to walk beside her, the answer was not given easily, because marriage meant crossing a line the world insisted could not be crossed. As the sun sank behind red cliffs and the land seemed to hold its breath, Ayanna said yes, not as surrender, but as choice. And in that choice, two broken worlds began to move toward one shared future. The wedding was not announced with church bells or town notices, but with whispered prayers, cautious hope, and a gathering beneath an endless sky where Apache drums met the steady rhythm of a cowboy's heart. And Luke Calder understood that marriage here was not a celebration alone, but a declaration of defiance. Men from nearby towns watched from a distance with narrowed eyes, unable to understand why a white cowboy would stand barefoot on sacred ground, while Apache elders studied Luke with the sharp patience of people who had learned never to trust quickly. Ayanna stood tall in traditional dress, her presence commanding silence, her strength undeniable, and when Luke took her hand, the frontier itself seemed to challenge them, as if daring them to survive what came next. Vows were spoken in two languages, promises shaped by hardship rather than fantasy. Luke swearing not ownership but partnership, Ayanna promising loyalty without surrendering her identity. And when the ceremony ended, there was no applause, only a deep sense that something irreversible had occurred. Trouble followed swiftly, because love that challenges power never goes unanswered. And within days, Luke's ranch was burned, his cattle scattered, and a warning carved into the remains, telling him he no longer belonged. Rage threatened to consume him, but Ayanna anchored him with calm strength, reminding him that survival was not about revenge, but resilience. They chose exile together, traveling toward contested lands where no law truly ruled, building a home from canvas, timber, and determination, and learning that marriage was not a shield, but a shared burden. Nights were filled with danger and tenderness, gunfire in the distance followed by quiet laughter near the fire, and each hardship deepened their bond rather than breaking it. Yet the world pressed harder when soldiers returned with orders to relocate the Apache people, tearing families apart under the banner of order. And Luke faced the most painful truth of the West, that good men serving bad systems still destroy lives. Torn between fighting and fleeing, Luke and Ayanna chose a third path, guiding families through hidden trails, using Luke's knowledge of the land and Ayanna's leadership to outmaneuver patrols. And in doing so, they became symbols of resistance whispered about in both camps and saloons. Their love became legend not because it was perfect, but because it endured, because it refused to shrink under hatred, and because every sacrifice they made was shared. When winter came early and illness threatened the camp, Luke traded his last rifle for medicine, proving once again that his vows were more than words. And when Ayanna nursed him back from fever weeks later, she understood that marriage was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a deeper fight for a life worth living. Spring arrived like forgiveness after years of bitterness, and Luke and Ayanna stood on a ridge watching children run freely across grass that had once been stained with fear, knowing they had survived something the world said was impossible. They settled near a remote valley where the land was harsh but honest, where neither town law nor military command reached easily, and there they built a new kind of home, one that honored Apache traditions and cowboy grit alike. Luke learned to listen before acting, to understand the land through stories rather than ownership, while Ayanna learned that some dreams could be shared without being stolen. And together they created a life that did not erase either past, but wove them together. Challenges never vanished because the West never forgave easily, but when threats came, they faced them side by side, teaching their children that strength came from respect, courage, and memory. Travelers spoke of a place where enemies laid down weapons, where a cowboy and an Apache woman ruled not by fear, but fairness, and slowly that place became real. Luke never pretended the world had changed, but he knew he had, and in quiet moments he would watch Ayanna singing at dawn, understanding that love had given him more than land ever could. Their marriage became a promise kept daily through work, loss, laughter, and unyielding hope. And when age finally softened their steps, they sat together beneath the same sky that once tested them, knowing the West had tried to break them and failed.